Today, I want to talk to you about something really interesting. It's this idea of existentialism and generally what the meaning of life necessarily is. Um, One really interesting thing to start off with is just this idea of a quote by Sartre, who says, "Man is condemned to be free because once thrown into the world, he's responsible for everything he does." Right? So the central tenet of the idea of existentialism, Sartre is one of the actual forefathers of the school of thought. There are people before him that sort of did lay the groundwork for what eventually would become existentialism, but you find Sartre being at the forefront of what this movement eventually becomes. There's this really fancy quote that is very tattooable material, and the quote by Sartre generally goes like, "Existence precedes essence," right? And it's quite interesting if you look at it. So necessarily it says that the idea of us existing and us being who we are and being born free to choose precedes any predefined notions of who we are to become, right? So no one dictates who we are or what we are to be in this world. So we get to choose our own path. And Sartre then actually has parts where he even talks about this idea of how a man who's born or grows up to become a waiter, and he typically acts like a waiter would, nodding at the right times, having his handkerchiefs and everything on spot. Necessarily, Sartre doesn't appreciate such a person because they're fitting into a box that human beings aren't necessarily born to fit into, right? So every one of us has an existence. We have a free will. And so in essence, he doesn't appreciate earnestness. He doesn't appreciate being someone you are not, right? So all of that's really good, but eventually existentialism leads to a different door, and that's generally this idea of, if we have all this free will and a lot of what's happening around us is dictated, then this whole idea of this world becomes very absurd. Now, the concept of the absurd is quite interesting, and to know that, you have to step into a philosopher or a writer that came after Sartre, and who most of you would know is known as Albert Camus, the famous writer of The Stranger. There's a book by Albert Camus called The Myth of Sisyphus, and then the second branch of that same ideology is extended to the book The Stranger. Don't worry if you haven't read it. I'm here to sort of give you an overview of what those philosophies are about. So Sisyphus is a Greek god who necessarily has been condemned to have this boulder that he keeps pushing up a mountain. So he's necessarily fighting gravity. And every night when he's reached the top, the boulder eventually rolls back down and Sisyphus has to push it back again. So till eternity, he's condemned to keep pushing the boulder up and down. And necessarily this same concept is called the absurd, right? So it's crazy what he's doing because there's no end goal. He's just pushing a rock, going through infinite struggle, and for nothing. So if you look at it, it does somewhat sound like our lives, right? We're waking up every morning, going to our workplaces, coming back and starting all over. It's a rat race. It means nothing. It's the absurd, as Camus would call it. So now that Camus spends time trying to establish that we live in the absurd, right? Then what do we do in the face of the absurd? How do we live our lives, right? And basically, Camus might not be the most optimistic of people, and he decides that there are three options. The first option is philosophical suicide. So basically, when you're trying to look for an answer, trying to understand why we live in such an absurd world, you can choose to go and look at certain doctrines, certain ideologies, and adopt them, right? By adopting these ideologies, you are necessarily committing philosophical suicide, because Camus presumes that there is no actual answer, and if you are to accept any answer, any ideology, you are accepting defeat and you're committing philosophical suicide. Kierkegaard's basic idea of leap of faith is when you generally don't have enough answers, but you just make a leap because that's what your faith demands of you, is not something Camus appreciates. Okay, now that we can't do philosophical suicide, the second option is that we commit actual physical suicide, right? Right? So he says basically, if there is no answer and this world is absurd, then why go through the suffering? Why go through the struggle of day-to-day activities? Why not just end it right there and then? But again, Camus doesn't encourage that option either. So then remains the final and third option, which is to revolt. That's when you are in a situation and you refuse to give up and you choose to live with the circumstances that you have, right? Camus suggests that if we are to live in this absurd world, the most that we can do is make something out of what we are going through. Try to live our lives, try to be happy despite our circumstances, and to accept that it's fine to not have a meaning to this world, and that it's okay that we have a free will and we have to deal with it. There's a very interesting line about Sisyphus, and Camus summarizes his struggle by saying, a struggle must be enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy.